In the darkest corners of the galaxy, where mercy is a forgotten concept and hope dies with the dying light of distant stars, there exists a truth that even the most hardened beings refuse to acknowledge. Sometimes, the smallest act of kindness can shatter the foundations of an empire built on cruelty. What happens when a species known for its relentless compassion encounters a universe that has forgotten what compassion means? What occurs when humanity's greatest weakness becomes its most terrifying strength? The Zephyrian Empire learned this lesson too late, when a single human refused to walk past a caged creature destined for death. They discovered that humans don't just rescue the innocent, they burn down entire systems to protect them. This is the story of how one small act of defiance ignited a revolution that would reshape the known galaxy, proving that sometimes the most dangerous weapon in the universe isn't technology or firepower. It's a human who has decided. The metallic screech of the cargo bay doors opening echoed through the sprawling Nexus station like the dying breath of some mechanical beast. Marcus Chen adjusted his worn leather jacket against the artificial chill and stepped onto the grimy platform, his boots making soft clicking sounds against the corrugated steel flooring. The smell hit him immediately, a mixture of industrial lubricants, alien spices, and something else he couldn't quite identify but instinctively disliked. Nexus Station sat at the crossroads of three major trade routes in the Outer Rim, a massive spinning wheel of metal and glass that never slept and never stopped moving. It was neutral territory technically, but everyone knew who really controlled the flow of goods and credits through this part of space. The Zephyrian Empire's influence reached even here, like the tentacles of some cosmic parasite that had wormed its way into every profitable corner of the galaxy. Marcus had been traveling for 3 weeks, jumping from one freight hauler to another, paying his way with odd jobs and what little remained of his savings. He was running from something, or maybe towards something. He wasn't entirely sure which anymore. The war had ended 6 months ago, officially, but for soldiers like him, it never really ended. It just changed shape, becoming nightmares instead of firefights, guilt instead of adrenaline. The Terran Federation had won, if you could call it winning. Humanity had successfully defended its borders and established its right to exist in a galaxy that seemed determined to either enslave or destroy them. But victory had come at a price that Marcus was still trying to calculate. Too many friends hadn't made it home. Too many cities on too many worlds bore scars that would take generations to heal. He pushed through the crowds of traders, pirates, smugglers, and refugees that made Nexus Station their temporary home. The diversity was staggering. Beings from dozens of different worlds and species, all united in their pursuit of profit or survival. Marcus had grown accustomed to being one of the few humans in any given space. Humanity was still relatively new to the galactic community, having achieved faster-than-light travel only 50 years ago. Most species treated humans with a mixture of curiosity and wariness, having heard stories about their peculiar tendency to form emotional attachments to almost anything with a pulse. The Zephyrians, however, were different. They treated everyone with the same cold efficiency, viewing other species as resources to be exploited or obstacles to be removed. Their empire had been expanding for over 2 centuries, absorbing worlds and civilizations like a cosmic vacuum cleaner. They were tall, grey-skinned beings with elongated limbs and faces that seemed permanently fixed in expressions of mild disdain. Everything about them radiated a sense of superiority that made Marcus's skin crawl. He was looking for passage to the Kepler system, where rumor had it that a group of human refugees were trying to establish a new colony on an unclaimed world. It seemed like the kind of place where a former soldier could disappear and maybe find some peace. But first, he needed to find a ship captain willing to take on a passenger with limited funds and no questions asked. The marketplace section of Nexus Station was a maze of stalls and shops built into what had once been cargo bays. Vendors hawked everything from exotic foodstuffs to illegal weapons modifications, their voices creating a constant buzz of commercial activity. Marcus navigated through the chaos, dodging hovercarts loaded with mysterious crates, and trying to avoid making eye contact with the various enforcement officers who patrolled the area with obvious boredom. It was near the back of the marketplace, in a section that smelled strongly of ozone and desperation, that Marcus first heard the sound. It was barely audible above the general din, a soft, rhythmic whimpering that seemed to be coming from somewhere below his current level. He paused, tilting his head to listen more carefully. There it was again, definitely coming from the lower level where the older shops and storage areas were located. Marcus almost kept walking. He had his own problems to worry about, and getting involved in whatever was happening down there would probably only complicate his life further. But something about the sound nagged at him, a quality of hopelessness that reminded him too much of wounded soldiers calling for medics who would never come. Against his better judgment, he found the nearest maintenance ladder and climbed down to the lower level. The corridors here were narrower and dimmer, lit by flickering fluorescent tubes that cast everything in an unsettling greenish glow. The sound was clearer now, definitely coming from somewhere ahead and to his left. Marcus followed it like a bloodhound, his military training automatically cataloguing potential threats and escape routes. The whimpering led into a service corridor lined with storage units and what looked like abandoned shops. Most of the spaces were dark and empty, their metal security shutters pulled down and sealed with rust and neglect. But one unit near the end of the corridor showed signs of recent activity. Light leaked out from beneath a partially raised shutter, and the sound was definitely coming from inside. Marcus approached carefully, every instinct screaming at him to turn around and walk away. Whatever was happening in there, it was none of his business. He had enough ghosts haunting his dreams without adding new ones. But when he crouched down and peered under the shutter, what he saw made his blood run cold. The space had been converted into some kind of makeshift holding facility. Metal cages lined the walls, and most of them contained creatures that Marcus didn't recognize. Some looked vaguely humanoid, others were clearly non-sentient animals, but all of them shared the same quality of defeated despair. They huddled in their confined spaces, some injured, all of them showing signs of neglect and abuse. But it was the cage in the center of the room that captured Marcus's attention. Inside was a being unlike anything he had ever seen, and yet somehow familiar in a way that made his chest tighten with unexpected emotion. She, and Marcus was somehow certain it was a she, despite the alien features, was roughly the size of a large house cat, with silver fur that seemed to shimmer in the artificial light. Her face was elongated and elegant, with large expressive eyes that currently held a depth of sadness that Marcus recognized from his own mirror. The being was chained inside her cage, heavy metal links wrapped around her small form and connected to bolts in the floor. The chains were clearly unnecessary, given the strength of the cage itself, which suggested they were there for psychological rather than practical reasons. Someone wanted this creature to know that she was completely powerless, that any hope of escape was an illusion. As Marcus watched, frozen in a mixture of horror and fascination, the silver-furred being slowly closed her eyes and seemed to settle into a position that suggested resignation. She had given up. Whatever fight had once burned in those expressive eyes had been systematically extinguished by whoever was responsible for this nightmare. The sound of footsteps echoing down the corridor snapped Marcus back to immediate awareness. He quickly pulled back from the shutter and pressed himself against the wall, trying to become invisible in the dim light. 3 figures approached the storage unit, their silhouettes unmistakably Zephyrian. They moved with the confident stride of beings who owned everything around them and had never been challenged on that ownership. "The buyers will be here in 2 hours," one of them was saying in the flat, emotionless tone that all Zephyrians seem to use. "Make sure the merchandise is properly sedated. We can't afford another incident like last time." "What about the Fellinis?" another voice asked. The chains seem excessive. Orders from the procurement division. Apparently, her species has some kind of psychic abilities when they're not properly restrained. Something about emotional manipulation through telepathic suggestion. The chains contain a neural inhibitor that prevents any such attempts. Marcus felt his jaw clench. He had heard about the Zephyrian slave trade, of course. Everyone in the galaxy knew about it, but most chose to look the other way. The Empire was too powerful and too profitable to cross over something as abstract as morality. But seeing it firsthand, watching a sentient being reduced to merchandise, and casual conversation about buyers made something dark and angry uncoil in Marcus's chest. The Zephyrians opened the storage unit with a series of electronic beeps and entered the makeshift prison. Marcus could hear them moving around inside, checking on their captives with the same detached professionalism that a farmer might use to examine livestock. The silver-furred being, a Fellinus apparently, didn't even open her eyes when they approached her cage.
"This one's completely broken," one of the Zephyrians observed.
"Good. Broken slaves are compliant slaves. The buyer specifically requested a young female with intact psychic abilities. Are we certain the neural inhibitors haven't caused permanent damage? The inhibitors only suppress the abilities, they don't destroy them. Once the chains are removed, her powers will return within a few hours. Of course, by then she'll be safely in her new owner's possession." Marcus closed his eyes and tried to tell himself that this wasn't his problem. He was one man with limited resources and no backup. Getting involved would accomplish nothing except getting himself killed or worse. The rational part of his mind laid out all the reasons why he should walk away. He didn't know anything about these beings. He had no idea how many Zephyrians were involved in this operation, and he had no legal authority to interfere with what was technically a legitimate business transaction under imperial law. But when he opened his eyes again, he found himself staring at the small hole beneath the shutter where he had first glimpsed the prison. And in his mind he could see those expressive eyes slowly closing in resignation, the way they had given up hope, with the quiet dignity of someone who had exhausted all other options. Marcus had spent the last 6 months trying to forget the war, trying to convince himself that he was just another veteran, looking for a quiet place to fade into obscurity. But standing in that dim corridor, listening to beings discuss the sale of a sentient creature like she was nothing more than property, he realized that some fights followed you no matter how far you ran. The Zephyrians finished their inspection and sealed the storage unit again, their footsteps echoing back down the corridor as they returned to whatever other business occupied their time. Marcus waited until he was certain they were gone before moving. He pulled out his personal datapad and began accessing the station's public directories, looking for information about the storage unit's ownership, security systems, and access protocols. It took him 20 minutes to hack into the basic information, using skills he had learned during his military service and hoped never to use again. The storage unit was rented to a shell corporation that was obviously a front for the Zephyrian operation. The security system was standard civilian grade, designed more to prevent casual theft than to stop someone with military training and proper motivation. Marcus spent another 10 minutes studying the layout of the lower level, mapping out potential escape routes and identifying possible complications. The rational part of his mind continued to provide a steady stream of reasons why this was a terrible idea, but he was no longer listening to that voice. Instead, he was remembering something his commanding officer had told him during the war. Sometimes, Chen, you've got to decide whether you want to be smart or whether you want to be able to live with yourself. Most of the time, you can't have both. He made his decision with the same quiet determination that had carried him through 3 years of combat. Marcus Chen was going to steal a Fellinis from a Zephyrian slave operation, and he was going to do it tonight. The fact that he had no idea what he would do with her afterwards seemed like a problem for future Marcus to solve. The next 3 hours passed with agonizing slowness as Marcus prepared for what was either going to be the most heroic act of his life or the last stupid thing he ever did. He used his remaining credits to purchase equipment from various vendors throughout the station: a portable plasma cutter, a small gravity sled, basic medical supplies, and a hooded cloak that would help disguise his identity and that of anyone traveling with him. As the station's artificial night cycle began and the crowds in the marketplace thinned out, Marcus made his way back to the lower level. He had studied the guard rotations and identified a window of opportunity when the area would be minimally patrolled. The storage unit's security system was linked to the station's main network, but Marcus had found a way to temporarily disable the alarms without triggering a general alert. Standing outside the storage unit with his plasma cutter in hand, Marcus allowed himself one final moment of doubt. He could still walk away. He could still catch that transport to the Kepler system and disappear into obscurity like he had originally planned. No one would ever know that he had been here, that he had seen what he had seen. But as he knelt down and activated the plasma cutter, Marcus realized that he would know. He would spend the rest of his life knowing that he had walked away when someone needed help, that he had chosen his own safety over doing what was right, and that was a burden he wasn't willing to carry. The plasma cutter sliced through the storage unit's lock like a hot knife through butter. Marcus pulled up the shutter just enough to slip inside, then immediately sealed it behind him. The space was dark except for the emergency lighting, and the various cages cast strange shadows on the walls. The air was thick with the smell of fear and desperation. Marcus moved quickly but carefully toward the center cage where the Fellinis was held. She was exactly as he had seen her before, small, silver-furred, and wrapped in chains that seemed designed more to humiliate than to restrain. Her eyes were still closed, but he could see her breathing, shallow and rapid, like someone experiencing a nightmare they couldn't wake up from. The lock on her cage was more sophisticated than the storage unit's security, but Marcus had come prepared for that possibility. The plasma cutter made quick work of the metal, and within minutes he was inside the cage, kneeling beside the chained Fellinis. Up close, he could see the full extent of what had been done to her. The chains were connected to a collar around her neck that pulsed with a faint red light, the neural inhibitor the Zephyrians had mentioned. Her fur was matted and dirty, and there were several small wounds that suggested she had been roughly handled during her capture and imprisonment. But it was her stillness that bothered Marcus the most, the complete absence of any defensive reaction to his presence. "Hey," he whispered softly, not wanting to startle her but needing her to know that something had changed. "I'm not here to hurt you. I'm here to get you out." The Fellinis' eyes opened slowly. and Marcus felt his breath catch in his throat. Her eyes were a deep violet color that seemed to shift and swirl like liquid amethyst. For a moment, she just stared at him with an expression that suggested she was trying to determine whether he was real or just another cruel hallucination designed to torment her. Marcus reached out carefully and touched the collar around her neck. The metal was warm to the touch, and he could feel a subtle vibration that made his fingertips tingle unpleasantly. "I'm going to get these chains off you," he told her, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I need you to stay very still, okay? Some of this equipment is pretty dangerous." The Fellinis didn't respond, but something in her eyes shifted slightly. Not hope, exactly, but perhaps the faintest recognition that this situation was different from what she had experienced before. Marcus took that as permission to continue. The plasma cutter made short work of the chains, though Marcus had to be extremely careful not to accidentally burn the Fellinis while cutting through the metal links. Each chain that fell away seemed to restore a little more life to her posture, though the collar remained firmly in place. Marcus examined it carefully, looking for some kind of release mechanism. "The collar is the tricky part," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "I'm going to need to—" He was interrupted by the sound of voices approaching from down the corridor. Marcus's blood turned to ice water as he recognized the flat tones of Zephyrian's speech, much closer than they should have been, according to his carefully calculated schedule. He had maybe 30 seconds before they reached the storage unit. "Change of plans," he whispered urgently to the Fellinis. "We're leaving right now." Marcus scooped the small being into his arms, surprised by how light she was despite the metal collar. The Fellinis didn't resist, but he could feel the tension in her small form, the way she held herself ready for whatever new cruelty was about to be visited upon her. The fact that she had no reason to trust him but was willing to let him carry her away spoke volumes about how desperate her situation had become. The voices were getting closer. Marcus moved to the back of the storage unit where he had identified an alternative exit, a maintenance hatch that connected to the station's service tunnel system. He had to set the Fellinis down for a moment to activate his plasma cutter and slice through the hatch's locking mechanism. "Just a few more seconds," he told her as sparks flew from the cutting tool. "We're almost out of here." The hatch came free just as Marcus heard the storage unit's main entrance being opened. He grabbed the Fellinis again and dove through the opening into the service tunnel beyond, pulling the hatch closed behind them just as the first Zephyrian entered the main space. The service tunnel was cramped and dark, barely wide enough for Marcus to crawl through while carrying his unexpected passenger. He could hear shouting from behind them as the Zephyrians discovered the empty cage and began searching for their missing merchandise. Marcus crawled as quickly as he could through the tunnel, following the mental map he had memorized earlier. The tunnel connected to a utility shaft that led up to the main level of the station. Marcus climbed one-handed, keeping the Fellinis pressed against his chest with his other arm. She remained perfectly still during the climb, but he could feel her heart beating rapidly against his jacket. They emerged into a maintenance closet in one of the station's less popular commercial districts. Marcus paused to catch his breath and check on his passenger. The Fellinis was looking around with what might have been curiosity, her violet eyes taking in their new surroundings with careful attention. "Are you okay?" Marcus asked softly. "I know this is all pretty confusing, but I promise I'm trying to help you." For the first time, the Fellinis made a sound, a soft musical vocalization that reminded Marcus of wind chimes in a gentle breeze. It wasn't quite speech, but there was definitely meaning in it, a quality that suggested communication even if he couldn't understand the specific content. Marcus wrapped the hooded cloak around both of them, making sure the Fellinis was completely hidden from view. The next part of their escape would require moving through more populated areas of the station, and he couldn't afford to have anyone notice his unusual companion. As they prepared to leave the maintenance closet, Marcus realized that his life had just taken a turn he could never have anticipated. 12 hours ago, he had been a drifting veteran with no particular purpose or destination. Now he was a fugitive harboring a stolen slave, with the entire Zephyrian Empire likely to be looking for them both. But as he felt the small weight of the Fellinis in his arms and saw the way her eyes had begun to show the first hint of something that might eventually become hope, Marcus knew he had made the right choice. Whatever happened next, he would face it with the knowledge that he had chosen to act when action was needed, that he had decided to be the kind of person his younger self would have been proud to become. The hunt for them would begin soon, but for now, they were free. And sometimes, Marcus reflected as they stepped out into the corridor, freedom was its own kind of victory. That enough is enough. The first 24 hours after the rescue were a blur of constant movement and mounting paranoia. Marcus had managed to book passage on a civilian transport headed for the Kepler system using false identification papers he had acquired from a forger in the station's black market district. The price had consumed most of his remaining credits, but staying on Nexus Station was no longer an option. By now, the Zephyrians would have discovered their missing property and begun a systematic search of every ship, cargo bay, and hiding place on the station. The transport ship was called the Wandering Star, a converted freight hauler that had seen better decades. Its captain was a grizzled Centaurian named Jorik, who asked no questions as long as the credits transferred cleanly. The passenger compartment was cramped and poorly ventilated, designed to carry cargo rather than living beings, but it was private and secure. Marcus had paid extra for a cabin that locked from the inside and had its own small hygiene unit. The Fellinis had not spoken a word since their escape, though Marcus was beginning to suspect that speech might not be her primary form of communication. She had settled into one corner of the narrow cabin, wrapping herself in the soft thermal blanket Marcus had purchased from a station vendor. Her violet eyes followed his every movement with an intensity that was both unnerving and strangely comforting. Marcus found himself talking to her as he went about the mundane tasks of organizing their limited supplies and checking the ship's departure schedule. He told her about the war, about his decision to leave Federation space, about his plans to find a quiet colony world where they could both disappear. He wasn't sure if she understood any of it, but talking helped calm his own nerves, and she seemed to listen with genuine attention. "I know this is all pretty overwhelming," he said, as he opened a package of military rations for their first meal aboard the ship. "I wish I could remove that collar, but I don't have the right tools. And I'm afraid I might hurt you if I try to force it. Maybe we can find someone in the Kepler system who knows how to deal with Zephyrian tech." The Fellinis tilted her head at the mention of the collar, raising one small hand to touch the device around her neck. The gesture was so obviously frustrated that Marcus felt a stab of sympathy. Whatever abilities the collar was suppressing, their absence clearly bothered her. Marcus divided the ration pack between them, not sure what a Fellinus might eat, but hoping that something in the standard mix would be suitable. He was surprised when she approached the food carefully and began eating with obvious hunger. Her movements were precise and almost ritualistic, as if sharing a meal had some deeper significance in her culture. As they ate in companionable silence, Marcus found himself studying her more carefully. The silver fur that covered her body wasn't uniform. There were subtle patterns and variations in color that became apparent in the cabin's soft lighting. Her face was elegantly elongated, with features that suggested intelligence and nobility despite her current circumstances. She was beautiful in a way that transcended species, with a grace and dignity that even captivity hadn't been able to diminish. "I don't even know your name," Marcus realized aloud. "Or, if your species uses names the way humans do, I'm Marcus, by the way." Marcus Chen. The Fellinis looked up from her food and made that soft, musical sound he had heard before. This time, the vocalization was longer and more complex, with rhythms and harmonies that suggested language, even if he couldn't understand it. She pointed to herself as she made the sound, then repeated it more slowly. "Is that your name?" Marcus asked. "I'm sorry, I don't think I can pronounce that properly. Would it be okay if I called you something else? Just until I can learn to say your real name correctly?" The Fellinis considered this for a moment, then made a different sound, shorter and somehow more accepting. Marcus took that as permission to continue. "You remind me of someone I used to know," he said thoughtfully. "A friend from before the war. Her name was Luna, and she had this way of looking at the world that made even terrible things seem like they might work out okay. Would Luna be all right?" The being that Marcus now thought of as Luna made another soft sound, this one with what seemed like approval. She reached out carefully and touched his hand, her fingers small and warm against his skin. The gesture was brief, but it sent an unexpected jolt of emotion through Marcus's chest. Not romantic or sexual, but something deeper and more fundamental. For just a moment, he felt less alone than he had in months. The feeling lingered even after Luna withdrew her hand. Marcus found himself wondering if this was what the Zephyrians had meant when they talked about her psychic abilities. If so, he thought, no wonder they were afraid of her. The capacity to share emotion so directly, to make another being feel less isolated, was a kind of power that an empire built on fear and oppression would find deeply threatening. The Wandering Star departed Nexus Station 6 hours later, its engines vibrating through the hull with the familiar rhythm of faster-than-light travel. Marcus felt some of the tension leave his shoulders as they entered hyperspace. They were committed now, beyond the reach of immediate pursuit. Whatever happened next, they had bought themselves time to figure out a plan. Luna seemed to relax as well, though Marcus noticed that she remained constantly alert, her large eyes darting toward any unexpected sound. She had positioned herself so that she could see both the cabin's entrance and its small porthole, never allowing herself to be surprised by an approach from either direction. The habits of a prisoner, Marcus realized. She had learned to sleep with one eye open. You're safe now, he told her as he dimmed the cabin lights for the sleep cycle. I know you don't have any reason to trust me, but I promise I'm not going to hurt you or hand you back to those bastards. Luna looked at him for a long moment, and Marcus had the distinct impression that she was trying to communicate something important. She made several soft sounds, varying the tone and rhythm in ways that suggested complex meaning. When Marcus could only shrug apologetically, Luna seemed to think for a moment, then tried a different approach. She moved closer to him, slowly and carefully, giving him every opportunity to signal if he was uncomfortable with her proximity. When Marcus remained still, Luna reached out and gently touched his temple with her fingertips. The contact was light, barely there. But Marcus immediately felt something change in his mind. It wasn't exactly telepathy, at least not the way he had always imagined it. Instead of hearing Luna's thoughts directly, Marcus suddenly found himself experiencing emotions and impressions that weren't his own. Gratitude, warm and overwhelming, flowed through him like sunlight. Relief so profound it brought tears to his eyes. And underneath it all, a bone-deep exhaustion that spoke of suffering endured for far too long. But there was something else as well. Something that made Marcus's breath catch in his throat. Luna wasn't just grateful for the rescue. She was grateful to him specifically, in a way that suggested she had been aware of his internal struggle before he acted. She had known that he was fighting with himself about whether to help, and his decision to act despite his fear had meant more to her than just freedom. The connection lasted only a few seconds before Luna pulled her hand away, but the impact lingered. Marcus stared at her in amazement. Luna's abilities weren't about control or manipulation. They were about connection, about sharing the emotional experiences that made beings feel less alone in an often hostile universe. "Thank you," Marcus whispered, his voice rough with unexpected emotion. "I didn't realize... I knew you were grateful, but I didn't understand how much this meant to you." Luna made another soft sound, this one somehow conveying both sadness and hope. She looked down at the collar around her neck, then back at Marcus, and he understood that she was trying to tell him that what he had just experienced was only a fraction of her true capabilities. The device was keeping her locked inside herself, cut off from the connections that were apparently as natural to her species as breathing was to humans. "I don't know how yet, but we will." For the first time since he had found her, Luna smiled. It was a small expression, barely more than a slight upturn at the corners of her mouth, but it transformed her face completely. The dignity had always been there, but now Marcus could see past the trauma to the person underneath. Intelligent, compassionate, and incredibly strong. The next few days aboard the Wandering Star fell into a comfortable routine. Marcus shared his meals with Luna, teaching her basic human words while trying to learn her musical language in return. Progress was slow but steady, and Marcus found himself looking forward to their communication attempts with an enthusiasm he hadn't felt about anything in months. Luna was clearly highly intelligent, picking up new concepts with surprising speed. She seemed particularly fascinated by human technology, spending hours examining Marcus's datapad and personal equipment with obvious curiosity. Marcus began to suspect that her species might be more technologically advanced than the Zephyrians had given them credit for. It was during one of these learning sessions that Marcus made a discovery that changed his understanding of their situation completely. He had been showing Luna news feeds from various galactic networks, trying to help her understand the current political situation. Most of the stories were routine: trade disputes, colonial expansion, the usual background noise of interstellar civilization. But one particular news item made Luna react with sudden intensity. The story was about a Zephyrian military patrol that had been found drifting in space, their ship intact but the crew apparently dead. The official report blamed equipment failure, but the images showed blast patterns that were clearly from weapons fire. What made the story interesting was that the patrol had been investigating reports of unusual energy signatures near an uncharted star system. Luna began making urgent sounds, pointing at the screen with obvious agitation. When Marcus looked at her questioningly, she touched his temple again, sending another burst of shared emotion. This time, the feelings were different. Fear, yes, but also desperate hope. And something that felt like recognition. Through the emotional connection, Marcus began to understand that Luna wasn't just any random Fellinis who had been captured by slave traders. She was someone important, possibly a leader or scientist, and her capture was connected to something much larger than a simple kidnapping for profit. The destroyed Zephyrian patrol had been looking for something in Luna's home system, and their deaths suggested that they had found more than they bargained for. When Luna broke the connection, Marcus found himself staring at her with new respect and growing concern. If she was right, then their escape from Nexus Station wasn't the end of their troubles, it was just the beginning. "Your people," Marcus said slowly. "They're fighting back against the Empire, aren't they?" Luna nodded, her expression grave. She made several complex sounds that Marcus was beginning to understand meant something like yes, but it's complicated. Over the next several hours, using a combination of Luna's limited telepathic abilities and increasingly sophisticated pantomime, Marcus began to piece together the true scope of their situation. The Fellinis weren't just random victims of Zephyrian expansion. They were a technologically advanced species that had been successfully resisting Imperial conquest for several years. Luna herself was apparently some kind of researcher or engineer who had been captured while working on a project of critical importance to her people's war effort. The destroyed patrols suggested that the Fellinis had access to weapons or technologies that could threaten Zephyrian military superiority. If that was true, then Luna wasn't just a rescued slave. She was a valuable intelligence asset that multiple parties would be very interested in recovering. Marcus felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders, the same feeling he had experienced during the war when civilian lives depended on his unit's success. But this time, it wasn't just about protecting innocent people from harm. This time, he might be in possession of information that could change the balance of power in an ongoing conflict. "The collar," he said suddenly, "it's not just suppressing your psychic abilities, is it? It's also preventing you from accessing technical knowledge or contacting your people." Luna nodded emphatically, touching the device around her neck with obvious frustration. She made a series of sounds that Marcus interpreted as urgent and time is running short. Marcus spent the rest of the day thinking about their options. The wandering star would reach the Kepler system in another 2 days, but he was no longer sure that hiding in a remote colony was the right choice. If Luna's information was as important as he suspected, then perhaps they had an obligation to do more than just disappear. But getting the collar off Luna would require specialized equipment and expertise that he didn't possess. And even if they managed that, contacting Luna's people would mean revealing their location to anyone monitoring interstellar communications. The Zephyrians might be authoritarian and cruel, but they weren't stupid. They would be watching for any sign of their missing prisoner. It was Luna herself who provided the solution, in her own typically indirect way. She had been studying Marcus's military identification papers, which he had kept despite leaving Federation service. The papers included his service record and commendations, including a citation for his role in defending the human colony of New Geneva against Zephyrian attack. Luna pointed to the citation, then to herself, then made a sound that Marcus had learned meant same or similar. It took him a moment to understand what she was trying to communicate, but when he did, Marcus felt his world shift on its axis. "Your people and mine," he said slowly. "We're allies, or we could be." Luna nodded vigorously, then touched his temple one more time. The emotion that flowed through the connection was complex, hope mixed with determination, and underneath it all, a sense of rightness that felt like a key turning in a lock. Marcus had been thinking of this as a rescue mission, a simple matter of saving one innocent being from a terrible fate. But Luna was trying to tell him that it could be something much more significant. The war between humanity and the Zephyrian Empire had officially ended, but the peace was fragile and temporary. Both species were still building their defenses and looking for advantages. An alliance with another species that had successfully resisted Zephyrian expansion could be exactly what humanity needed to ensure its long-term survival. And Luna, despite her current circumstances, might be the key to making that alliance possible. "Okay," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was contemplating. "Change of plans. We're not hiding in some remote colony. We're going to get that collar off you, contact your people, and then we're going to see about saving 2 civilizations." Luna's smile this time was brilliant, transforming her entire face with an expression of joy so pure that Marcus felt his own spirits lift in response. For the first time since the war ended, he had a mission that mattered, a purpose that extended beyond his own survival. The wandering star continued its journey toward the Kepler system, but its passengers were no longer running away from something. They were running toward it, toward a future that might hold hope for billions of beings across the galaxy. Marcus spent that night planning their next moves, thinking about how to contact Federation intelligence without revealing too much over unsecured channels. Luna curled up in her corner of the cabin, but Marcus noticed that her posture was different now, less defensive, more relaxed. She was no longer just a victim waiting for rescue. She was a partner in an enterprise that could reshape the political landscape of known space. As he drifted off to sleep, Marcus couldn't help but smile at the irony of his situation. He had set out to rescue one small, helpless creature from a terrible fate. Instead, he had apparently recruited a brilliant scientist and potential diplomat who might hold the key to humanity's future. Sometimes, Marcus thought as sleep claimed him, the most important missions were the ones you never saw coming. The Kepler system was everything the tourist brochures claimed, and nothing like what Marcus had expected. 3 inhabited worlds orbited a stable yellow star, each one showcasing humanity's remarkable ability to adapt and thrive in the most challenging environments. New Geneva was the industrial heart, its orbital shipyards and manufacturing platforms glinting like scattered jewels against the star's light. Harmony served as the agricultural center, its vast terraformed continents feeding much of the outer colonies. But it was Sanctuary, the smallest and most remote of the 3 worlds, that had become their destination. Sanctuary had been designed as a refuge for war veterans and civilian casualties, a place where those who had been broken by the conflict with the Zephyrian Empire could find peace and healing. It was also, Marcus had learned through careful research during their journey, home to some of the Federation's most advanced research facilities. If anyone could safely remove Luna's neural inhibitor collar, it would be the scientists and engineers working on Sanctuary's classified projects. The wandering star docked at Sanctuary's primary spaceport, on a grey morning when the planet's twin moons were visible as pale crescents in the dawn sky. Marcus had spent the final day of their journey coaching Luna on human customs and basic Federation protocols. She was a quick learner, picking up not just the language, but the subtle social cues that would help her navigate human society without attracting unwanted attention. The collar remained a constant reminder of her captivity, but Luna had learned to hide it beneath the high-necked clothing Marcus had purchased during their brief stop at a commercial station. To casual observers, she appeared to be simply another refugee, seeking sanctuary on a world known for welcoming those displaced by war. Marcus had used the ship's communication array to send a carefully worded message to his former commanding officer, Colonel Sarah Martinez, who was now serving as liaison between Federation intelligence and the Sanctuary research facilities. The message had been brief and cryptic, asking for a private meeting to discuss matters of mutual interest regarding recent Zephyrian activities. He could only hope that Martinez would remember their wartime friendship and agree to see him before asking too many questions. The spaceport on Sanctuary was smaller and quieter than the massive commercial hubs Marcus had grown accustomed to during their journey. The architecture was deliberately welcoming. All curved lines and natural materials designed to put traumatized minds at ease. Gardens and water features were scattered throughout the terminal, and the artificial gravity was set slightly lower than standard, creating a sense of lightness that seemed to affect everyone's mood. Luna stayed close to Marcus as they navigated the arrival procedures, her large violet eyes taking in everything with obvious fascination. Despite the collar's suppression of her abilities, she seemed to be picking up on the emotional atmosphere of their surroundings. The desperation and fear that had characterized Nexus Station were entirely absent here, replaced by something that felt like hope tempered with hard-won wisdom. They checked into a modest hotel near the spaceport, taking a room with twin beds and a view of the surrounding mountains. Marcus had booked them for 3 days, which should give him enough time to make contact with Martinez and arrange whatever help Luna might need.